things over to Judy Meyer.
Thank you very much, and good evening. Thank you for attending tonight's Newsroom Live. My name is Judy Meyer. I'm the executive editor of the Sun Journal, the Kennebec Journal, the Morning Sentinel, and the Western Maine Weekly newspapers of the Maine Trust for Local News. Tonight, we are joined by former Representative Emily Cain, a Democrat who served as the House Minority Leader from 2010 to 2012, and Republican Representative Laurel Libby, who is currently seeking her third term in the Maine House, serving District 64 in Auburn. She is being challenged for her seat by Democrat Dan Campbell, and we are here tonight to talk about Maine's 2nd Congressional District race. The conversation will be moderated by Sun Journal political reporter Steve Collins, who has been covering this race for our readers. The contentious CD2 race between three-term Democrat incumbent Congressman Jared Golden and challenger Austin Theriault, a Republican who is currently serving in the Maine House representing Fort Kent, is being watched across the country as one of the few swing district contests that could decide control of the U.S. House of Representatives. Before we begin, I want to thank our subscribers who help sustain us in our mission every day. And I want to thank our sponsor, Murray, Plum & Murray. Their support allows us to hold these kinds of events and conversations beyond our pages and our websites. I would like to introduce attorney Lauren Wellever from Murray, Plum & Murray. Lauren?
Thank you, Judy. Yes, hello, my name is Lauren Wellever, and I'm a partner in the estate planning group of Murray, Plum & Murray, a full-service general practice law firm in Portland. We are proud sponsors of the Newsroom Live series and supporters of local independent news. I am very excited to have this evening's panelists share their thoughts on Maine's consequential 2nd District race. I'd like to thank them, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this important and informative discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you, Lauren. Now let's turn things over to Steve and to our guests, Emily and Laurel. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first, let me thank Laurel and Emily for being here on this Newsroom Live. The way politics are today, it's never easy to do anything like this, and I'm glad that you're willing to. Let's just start right off. So this is about the 2nd District. What makes the 2nd District special? When do you want to take a shot at it?
Laurel, we can't hear you. I saw you start, so I didn't want to talk over you, but I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. I thought this was awesome, I guess. Hey guys, I was just up in the county last week, and it just reminded me, when I drive through central and northern Maine, it's the heart of Maine, right? This is these are folks who are they're the down-to-earth, everyday Mainers. They are the heart of our state. And so when I think of the 2nd District, I think of really, hardworking, independent-minded folks. And that's part of what makes this race so interesting. We do have a lot of independent-minded folks in Maine. That's how Jared Golden has been in his seat in that district as long as he has. And that's also what means that district could flip this year. So it's been a pretty interesting race to watch.
Thanks so much, Steve. And first, I just want to remind everyone who's watching that tomorrow is the last day to early vote in person all across Maine. Tomorrow, if you're watching this after Halloween, is the last day. It's not scary. You can go to your town office and you can vote in person at any town office all across Maine. And then after that, you have to go in person on Election Day on Tuesday, or if you already have your absentee ballot, you can drop it off in one of the drop boxes in your town. Thanks for having me. As someone who has traveled every square inch of the 2nd District many, many times and continues to do it regularly, there are some fun facts to know about the 2nd District. It's actually the largest district east of the Mississippi River, which is really interesting. It includes an international border. It includes one state border and the ocean on the other side. And actually the rest of New England can fit inside just the 2nd District. So if you think about it from a scale, I know you laugh, but as someone who has put thousands and thousands of miles on her car, traveling it personally many times in the last 20 years, I can tell you that it's all beautiful. But it's not the same from one end to the other. right? With the more populated regions around Bangor and then around Lewiston and Auburn to, of course, the crown of Maine in Aroostook County to down east where I was just a few weeks ago visiting friends in Washington County to the beautiful, mountains in Western Maine. We are so fortunate to have such a diverse and rich economic background in Maine, such history in the 2nd District. And politically, this is a district that has been held by Democrats and Republicans over many decades. And it's a district that went, in fact, for the Democrat for president every single time from 1992 on until 2016, when it was won by Donald Trump, and then again when he won it in 2020. We've had, of course, the advent of ranked choice voting in the 2nd District, and that's where we saw Congressman Golden initially win with ranked choice voting in 2018, and then steadily win ever since then in this fiercely independent district. So I think it's a really exciting time. Climate change is playing out here, energy costs, paper mills that have closed, manufacturing has changed, the agriculture has changed. I would love if we could bring back Margaret Chase Smith and talk to her about the 2nd District compared to now. It would be fascinating to see what her take would be. But it's no surprise to me that we have a fierce race going on in the 2nd District, particularly with someone as fiercely independent as Jared Golden, who has won the support with bipartisan support in this district since 2018, but in a tough race now for sure.
Yeah. So a reader said that there are 2 Maines, and do you agree with that? Is this or is it somehow different than the 1st District?
I have to tell you, I disagree with it completely. Anybody who says that has not actually been to the 2nd District, and I say that with love. As someone who's lived in the Bangor area, for 25 plus years now, it was always surprising to me when I was in the legislature how many of my colleagues from Southern Maine hadn't even been to Bangor, and how much work there we had to do to get people from Southern Maine to see the beauty, the excitement, the dynamic nature of the 2nd District. And I was always the first to say, why don't you come up and see, right? Home of the University of Maine, right here in my own backyard in Orono, as well as such the rich agricultural and manufacturing and fishing history of our state. There's a lot going on up here, and I think anybody who says there's 2 Maines needs to come visit.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take on that, Emily. I agree with you completely. Right, we've got diversity of economic opportunity in, the 2nd District. We've got certainly a variety of businesses. We've got we've got some similarities, but we also have vast differences. And you talk about the size of the 2nd District. The size of the 2nd District compared to the 1st District is dramatic. And yet we have, a large population center in the southern portion in the CD1. And, if you look at the population in CD2 and CD1, you see a lot of differences politically. And that's what's coming into play here in this race. That CD2, yeah, that's the flippable seat here. CD1 is not in play. So CD2 is the race to watch. And, I hear from constituents and then folks who do live north of here, who live in the Bangor area and north, or live in Washington County. They feel like it is 2 Maines, and that the folks who live in Southern Maine don't, as you alluded to, don't understand maybe the needs and the diversity in the 2nd District as well as they could or should, particularly when we get talking about the legislature later on this evening.
Yeah, I will say there's definitely, I think what has shifted in my perception, as I served 10 years in the state legislature, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was 20 years ago next week that I was elected for the first time to the state house, and it has been 10 years since I was actively elected there. And what always struck me is how, at the time that I was there, very little fell on true partisan lines, Democrats and Republicans. It was much more likely to fall on coastal versus inland, northern versus southern, Lakes region versus other, and Portland against everybody, right? If the whole Portland delegation was united, everybody else was like, wait a second, we should check this out. Like, we need to make sure. I say it, but it's true, right? And it was sort of the service center economies versus the more rural economies. I think that has shifted in the last 10 years. Definitely has become more of a partisan red and blue, Democrat and Republican divide in my observation and my regular reading of this paper and other major daily newspapers in the state that I'm not sure I'm allowed to say out loud, but program, but I am an active subscriber to, and I think that is true and certainly something that needs to be worked on. Right? We need less partisanship in Maine, not more.
Yeah, I think Steve's going to tell us in a minute that we're off track, and we better get back to the active CD2 race in our conversation. You and I, with our background in the legislature, I think are prone to maybe visiting that territory. But I'd love to hear your take, Emily, from where you are about the race. And it feels like things have really shifted in the last couple of weeks. So what's your take on where you are? You're not down here in Auburn, so I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so I'm here just north of Bangor in Orono, and I am getting all of the ads just like everybody else is in the presidential and in Maine too. And I think you've seen both campaigns shift to sort of their closing arguments in the final weeks. And I should say up front, I've known Jared since he worked at the State House. I knew him when he met his amazing wife, Izzy. And if you haven't seen Jared's closing ad that features Izzy and his two daughters, it is quite beautiful. And his kids are really cute. But I think the thing to know about Jared is he takes a very careful and thoughtful approach to everything. I mean, the man literally writes it all down online on something called Substack that you can read it. And I think he's very transparent and it's very thoughtful and puts it all out there. And even when I disagree with him, which I sometimes do, I believe people want leaders who tell the truth and explain their tough decisions. And I think you've seen a contrast where Jared has shifted his final messages to ones of bipartisanship, to standing up for women's reproductive health, and to highlighting his personal why in his family. And you've seen Austin, I think, make the smart political play to just say, I'm with Donald Trump. This is a district that's going to go for Trump. You see Austin in his closing ads use independent validators, and the outside ads are making the same case that Austin, like he did in his primary, is being very clear. He supports former President Trump. He is supported by former President Trump, who has been doing phone calls with supporters to get them to, come out to vote for Austin. I think what you're seeing is Jared's being Jared. He's going to say, here's who I am, take it or leave it. You might not like it, but here's what I believe and here's what I stand for. And you see Austin as a newcomer, right? Someone who's introducing himself saying, the President Trump's probably going to win the 2nd district. I'm going to bank my closing arguments on that connection. I think that's probably his wisest choice, in fact.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there, Emily. Starting with what you said about, the Trump card, right? That is key because Austin has to win back some of these voters, Republicans that have been voting for Jared Golden. I mean, that is a key segment. And so when you look at that race, that is the smart play, as you say. I have to say, I also agree. Look at all of this agreement here. That ad was beautiful. If folks haven't seen it, you will. I'm sure it's going to be all over the airwaves. Very, very smart ad. Very, family centric, and that very much plays well to that demographic in CD2. And the timing of the second child arriving literally could not be better.
I don't know, but I'm sure that was not planned. I don't know if politicians ever actually successfully planned that kind of thing. That's very funny.
Yeah, right.
You literally couldn't plan it better. So Jared absolutely does have that going for him. But I have to say, you say that right what he's thinking. And I have to say, I think that has been his one misstep, his first and biggest misstep. I don't know if he would call it a misstep, but I think politically it certainly was. Last October, after the shooting in Lewiston, at the press conference where Jared first made the comment about his hair. And that did not go over well, given the tragedy that had just occurred. And then he reversed himself on his stance on the Second Amendment. And we're talking about CD2, not CD1. And so that has come into play in a big way. And that's part of why, I think that we're seeing the uptick in the polls that we are for Austin Theriault is, folks question if they can count on Jared Golden on the Second Amendment, because he's saying one thing about one piece of it, right? And then another about another piece of it. And so it doesn't make a cohesive whole necessarily for folks anymore. And they're concerned that their Second Amendment rights might be at risk if Jared Golden remains in that seat. So, I think that he probably was being genuine and saying exactly what he thought. But I think that could cost him the race.
It's interesting. And I think, that night in Lewiston was personal to everyone in Maine for a different reason.
Absolutely.
We ever needed to point to something that showed you what a small town Maine is, there wasn't a household in Maine that night that wasn't worried about somebody they love. And I think, and Jared, of course, being from Lewiston, living in that town, that city, it was especially personal for him, as I'm sure it was for you, Laurel, living not far from there either. I think it takes guts to change your mind on something. It takes guts, but I want to be very clear. Jared has not in any way changed his mind on the Second Amendment. He has changed his mind on the assault weapons ban. He's changed his mind on whether or not there should be an assault weapons ban. He wrote an op-ed in the other paper I'm not supposed to say, probably that starts with a B and has BDN in it, but he wrote an op-ed. You can read it in his own words.
You can mention it.
Jared wrote an op-ed in the Bangor Daily News again because he was willing to say, look, this is where I am. He wants to treat assault weapons the same way that we treat machine guns. This would stop future sales and require you to get a permit for current ones. And again, this led Jared to do some soul searching, to confront the current and new realities of gun violence in Maine, in a place I remember being able to say that probably won't ever happen here, right? Because everybody respects guns here. Nobody's really anti-Second Amendment here in Maine because everybody owns guns and everybody's neighbors do. We feel safe. And then Lewiston happened. And I think it caused Jared to do some real soul searching in public as a public figure, which is not where most people have to do their soul searching. And again, confront that new reality of gun violence. But I'll be very clear. I can't ever speak for Jared, but I can say as someone who supports him that I am confident he has not changed in any way his support for the Second Amendment, but rather his position on the assault weapons ban.
Yeah, I hear that, Emily, and sure, perhaps he hasn't fully changed his stance on the Second Amendment, but what we're talking about here with the upcoming election is not what Jared Golden says about his stance, but how Maine voters translate that and how that translates to their ballot. So, that's what's at play here. And I think that is what will dictate the outcome, not what Jared says about his stance and how he's updated that, but actually how Maine voters translate what he said. And that could be two very different things. And I think that's why we're seeing guns and the Second Amendment be such a big issue in this election, because at the end of the day, the voters get to have the final say, and they're the ones who will decide whether they like that stance or not.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I mean, you can see it. I don't know if you've got the chat up, but you can see Democrats and Republicans are disagreeing with me, and I think they're mad at me and they're mad at you. And I get it, and I know some of those people in those chats personally, and I appreciate their comments. But I think when you look at this election, you mentioned something key, Laurel, which is Austin is trying to make sure he gets all those Republican votes, including the ones that have gone to Jared. Right. It's math is a thing. It's hard to avoid. Jared has definitely gotten some Republican votes in his elections in the past. But now, earlier this fall, there was a lot of talk of, is Jared going to get all the Democratic votes? Right. And I think that's where we have two things that come into play. One is ranked choice voting, right, which we've seen before, where people can choose to vote for somebody else in that first column, as long as somebody doesn't get to 50%, those other votes count. And can be then allocated to the other person that you want. But I think when it comes for Democrats and for a lot of independents and even Republicans right now in the second district and all over the country, there are also two other issues that are really important. One is access to women's reproductive health care. It's choice. It's reproductive freedom. Jared supports the Women's Health and Reproductive Freedom Act. He's personally supported efforts to protect, support, and expand access to IVF and also democracy, right? Jared is focused on making sure that we can have a proper certification of a free and fair election in our country. And I think that concept of holding the majority, getting the majority back, right, in the U.S. Congress is something that will drive a lot of Democrats in the 2nd District who may be grumpy with Jared over any number of things to say, I'd rather have Jared there than Austin. And I think that's going to play out for Republicans too, right? That question of sort of issues, partisanship, and power that are going to play out in this race.
Absolutely. And also what issues trump which issues, right? And so
you can't even use Trump anymore in a sentence.
Sorry.
I mean, I don't know.
We have in so many contexts, right? Which
Yeah.
issues are most important to the voters? And, you bring up abortion. And certainly that is an issue that folks bring up very rarely compared to issues like the economy, cost of living, property taxes, which are all interrelated, and trailing behind them, as I'm interacting with voters across the state, I hear about, education and healthcare. But the top line issues that people are talking about across Maine are the issues that affect their wallets, those kitchen table issues. And the fact is, I hear a lot more about 401ks from 4 years ago than I do about abortion. And so that is a great question. What are people going to vote on this election? And we'll see if the economy and cost of living, if that plays out in this election. But I think that it has grown in importance in folks' minds. And the question to me is, are folks now linking both at the federal level and the state level, the folks who are in power, right? Jared Golden, the current majority in the state house, is that linked to folks' wallets at this point or not? And I think that comes into play in CD2.
I think that's right. And the interesting question is that of perception of how the economy versus sort of technical health of the economy, right? We saw some more positive numbers out today. You see positive job numbers, you see economic growth numbers. The question is, do people feel it, right? And that's fundamentally at play in the presidential race as well. I actually think the economy has been more of a driver of certainly the conversation in the public ads in the presidential race than it has been in the 2nd District, right? We saw some early ads in the 2nd District about energy and about things like that, but it's not been as much about the economy. I think certainly state legislative races, and I'm sure we'll get to that.
Absolutely.
But the presidential race is really one where the economy is going to be a central driver. And again, it's that question of how do you feel about the economy versus how's the economy doing, and where do you get your facts and your feelings, right? And I was earlier today, I was telling someone I was doing this and telling we were going to talk about what's motivating voters, and they cautioned me appropriately to not make those assumptions, because it's not just one thing, right? On any given day, it's many things, right? We could talk about, and we probably won't get into today because neither of us are experts, but international affairs is driving somehow some people feel about candidates and elections, as well as the economy, as well as abortion. I think it's a matter of how all these things come together and what your gut tells you about the future that you want for your country and your state.
Yeah, absolutely. It does come down to the gut for so many people, right? And that's why this is such an interesting race, because, I don't know if you saw the story today about the schools that, 140 schools across Maine had elections yesterday, and they got to vote. And the race went overwhelmingly to Trump over Kamala Harris. But what was so interesting to me is that the race for CD2 was half a point different. Jared Golden won that race in the schools by half a point. He squeaked it out. And so, since 2008, Maine students have been predicting the winner of the presidential election accurately. And so that's certainly
in the 2nd District. I'm going to clarify, in the 2nd District.
In the 2nd District.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it's just, that's certainly not a poll per se, but it is an interesting kind of human interest piece coming into this election. And it's really interesting. It gets me wondering, who are those swing voters? Of course, we got students here, but that has been the typical, right, is folks are swinging, not just they're voting for Trump, but then they're voting for Jared Golden. And so that's certainly interesting going into the election.
I know.
Where do you think that's happening?
Sorry, Steve. I guess we should probably.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. So,
Going.
but what? So, Laurel, why do you think that there'd be people who were for Trump and also for Golden? Which obviously in that student thing there were.
Yeah, people vote for someone they like. When you talk to folks who are not in the bubble of politics, they want to like the person they vote for. And, Jared, he wears flannel and Carhartts. They're very clean Carhartts, but he wears flannel and Carhartts, and he looks like, your everyday Mainer. I think that might be wearing out a little bit. It's a little bit jarring when you see the flannel and vest next to the suit in a debate. And I think that's gotten I think that might be getting a little old. I don't know if that's helping him as much as it used to in that context. So people like Jared. He's a likable guy, and so that means people are willing to swing and vote a different way. And you see that up and down the ticket in Maine. Folks really are independent minded. They want to like the person they're voting for. And sometimes that means that they don't vote straight party lines. They might vote all over the place, depending on who they like the best.
Well, and I think that really gets to the point of who do you feel like and you trust too. And I think at Maine, that is very Maine, right? When people ask me about, even when Democrats have held more things or when Republicans after 2010 held all the majority in the state, Maine was still pretty purple, right? We have an independent senator, we have a Republican senator, we have two very different Democratic members of the U.S. House, right? And we have a legislature that, while Democrats have held the majority off and on in the Senate and in the House since 2012, it's not sort of pure ideological majority, right? And we've had both Republican and Democratic governors in recent years, and not so long ago, our independent senator was our independent governor. So we have a track record of doing what we think is best as Mainers, and I think there is. That's why you see so many candidates for state legislature still knocking on thousands of doors for themselves, because they really feel like, I've been out of office for 10 years and I still go to the grocery store and get stopped, right, about to ask me questions or to ask me about what's going on in Augusta, or can I help somebody with something? And I always say yes. That sort of personal touch in Maine goes a long way. And I think Jared, Laurel, you're talking about like the Carhartts and the flannel like it's some sort of shtick, but that's actually Jared. I think it was the suit that he couldn't wait to shake off and get back to his how he really felt like reflected who he is. He's very consistent about it, and I think it's authentically him.
Yeah, that's a good point, about the folks feeling like someone and that you're seeing them in the everyday. And that's something that somebody had brought up to me last night. And that's, I think it took Austin a bit of time to define himself. I would say if there was, a drawback that he had, it was that took a little bit, right? He's against a fierce opponent, that's for sure. And as time went on, I think that has happened more and more. And last night I had a gentleman say to me, he said, I really like, speaking of that personal touch, he said, I really like that I see on social media, that's where he's getting a lot of his information is on social media these days, right? I see Austin in small groups, right? I see him with 5 people at a time. I see him visiting this business and this business. And that tells me, that he is all about that personal touch that you're talking about. People do. That's what they respond to. And that's what makes them vote one way or another, is that personal touch.
So let's talk about the legislature for a minute. So do Republicans have a chance of taking over the Senate or the House in Augusta?
I'm going to defer to Laurel to take the question first, since she's the sitting legislator.
Okay.
And I will go. I will bring my. I'll go second on this one.
Okay.
Unless you want me to go first, I'm happy.
No, that's fine.
I wanted to offer you the chance if you wanted to grab it, but
no, go for
yeah.
it.
You know, I think that nothing is a done deal with the legislature. There's no slam dunk here. And I think that the House is at play. The Senate is not. I don't see the Senate as being a viable flip. But the House, there's a chance. There are multiple legislators who have turned out. That means open seats where new legislators, you know, Democrat and Republican, they're duking it out. And so there are opportunities there. But in this election, certainly every seat matters. And, you know, if you look at past elections, every vote matters. So in 2022, the majority was decided by only 1,417 votes across the entire state. That's the 10 closest House districts. So when we're talking about, you know, districts being at play and the majority being at play, these are really small margins. Races are won and lost by a handful of votes. And so if I were to give a prediction, my prediction would be that the majority is going to be won or lost by very close margins. I don't see, you know, an 80+ split with somebody being in a strong minority. I think we're much closer to, you know, 76, 75, 77, 74, something like that. That's my kind of overview. Emily, I'd love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, so let's start with the Senate. So I think what's interesting about the Senate is the Senate has been the more volatile of the two chambers, right? The Senate is a chamber that has flipped, by my count, at least 4 times in the past 14 years. And the Senate campaign is running hard campaigns in all 35 districts, but they have strong incumbents termed out, including Senate President Troy Jackson. The Senate district that I sit in, that I used to represent, is certainly very competitive right here in Orono with Senator Mike Tipping. They are running tight races, but I think the edge goes to the Democrats here. They have some strong candidates running in tough places, but I think from an overall map perspective, they're in a stronger position. But let's talk about the House. And I take the House pretty personally. I have the distinction of being the only Democrat in, I'm going to say, in mine and Laurel's lifetime of being in the minority leader, right? I know what it feels like to lose the majority. I know what it feels like to do the work to take it back. And I take this very seriously and took a look at it. So you start off with a tough environment, right? Something called ballot roll-off is a real thing, not just in Maine, but across the country, where people come out to vote for the top of the ticket. And then they get kind of like, oh, what's on the back? Or like, oh, I saw a sign for that person. You know, that ballot roll-off is a real thing. And you see it across the country, and it's a real factor. And it's one of the reasons why you see Republicans and Democrats right now saying, vote all the way down the ballot. Even all the questions, like, vote all the way down the ballot. But for the Democrats in the House right now, they are defending an abnormally large number of seats, which means the Republicans have a large map to go at. So there are almost 3 times as many incumbents that are termed out. I think there are 8 or 9 Democrats who are termed out, and there are 3 Republicans, but there are 14 Democratic incumbents who made the decision not to run again. And where they are matters. Many of them are in tough swing districts that have had really strong candidates. 2 I know personally very well, soon to be former State Representative Kevin O'Connell in Brewer, and my old friend and former colleague, State Representative Ann Perry in Calais. You have tough races where, you know, strong candidates like in Augusta, where the state representative, Reagan LaRochelle, is now running for the Senate, who initially had won that seat. You also have Scott Landry in Farmington, who is not running. And so I think you have this real challenge where Democrats seemingly have big numbers, right, with 83 in the majority currently, but they're really not when you think about how many seats are open. It's really anybody's chamber. And I think the fact that you've also seen unprecedented investment and spending on the Republican side, the Republican State Legislative Committee has put more than $1 million in to support Republicans and go against the Democrats just in the last month. Right? That is unprecedented. I have never seen that much outside money come in for state legislative races in Maine. And maybe Laurel and her colleagues have also raised and spent more than $500,000 just through their own leadership PACs and other things in the last month as well. Democrats have struggled to keep up right? As national money has not followed here in the same way. So I think we have a tough map, but my edge goes to the Democrats here. I know some of these candidates. I know the operation that they're running. There's a lot of experience there. They don't take it for granted. And I think candidate recruitment really matters. And ultimately, my edge goes to the Democrats here, but it's not going to be without a lot of sweat and tears probably in the next week.
So in the legislative races, is it it's obviously there's a lot of personality, people, you know, how they're connecting with people. Are there issues that are sort of running across the gamut that are making a difference on which way people will vote?
Yeah, you know, and this is why I might give the edge to the Republicans, Emily. A small
I'm not shocked, Laurel. I expected you.
Shocking no one, but not an enormous edge, a small edge, and that's because of the issues that folks are talking about. You know, people in Maine are struggling, and in a lot of these districts where we're looking at the potential of flipping from Democrat to Republican, a lot of people are struggling. You know, we're hearing about things like the repeal of the property tax freeze for seniors. That is impacting thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Maine. And frankly, seniors don't care why it was repealed or how it was repealed, but they do care about who repealed it. And so the fact that that rests, you know, almost 100% on Democrat shoulders is certainly, I think, coming into play. On top of that, we have high energy costs. We're hearing about that all the time for Mainers, particularly in some of these swing districts. And so, you know, I think Mainers have started to figure out that they're paying these really high solar subsidies, and that it's not even coming out of, you know, tax coffers, which is sometimes easier to cover, but that it's coming from ratepayers, which is, you know, you and I, all of us here. And that is starting to kind of, the chickens are coming to roost there. We hear about businesses like the business in Milo that is looking at closing with their $6,000 a month increase in their electricity bill. This is impacting businesses, it's impacting families and individuals here in Maine. And when you add that into the higher cost of living that we're facing with the current economy, like you said, Emily, it doesn't really matter what folks say about the numbers. It matters how it is impacting people on their bottom line. And when you're bringing home a paycheck and it's all going straight out the door, that matters to folks. And I think we're hopefully going to see that coming into play in the election here is the Republican thought process. So that is, you know, election day will say if that does come into play, as much as folks are talking about it across the state. And I think that is the reason that I give Republicans the edge, because you're right. The Democrats have held the majority for most of the last 40 years. So if folks are feeling the punch, who are they naturally going to say, hey, I'm feeling the punch? Who's been in charge for 40 years?
You know, I think that candidates matter in these races, and you have some really interesting races that are pickup opportunities for Democrats where longtime leaders are putting their names forward to run again because they are people who know how to work across the aisle and represent their communities, particularly in places like Aroostook. Both John Martin and Danny Martin, who have done more for Aroostook County in the last many decades than anybody else on their own, or particularly combined, that we'd be lucky to have them back in the legislature. You've got great candidates like Scott Cuddy in Winterport, who's running again in a tough race, but trying to run hard there. Mike LaJoy, your neighbor in Lewiston, who's a beloved figure in that community, someone I served with, former fire chief, former head of the Franco Center, was a great city councilor there, and new candidates too running across the districts. But the issues do matter, right? And what the candidates that I've talked to, what they're hearing at the doors is people, they want elected officials who can get along, who can be bipartisan. They don't want to, you know, they don't want culture fights. They want you to focus on what's going to help kids, what's going to help the future, what's going to help lower the costs of living in Maine. There's no question that those are the kinds of things that are on their minds. And when you hear about energy, you're hearing about it in all the ways that Laurel articulated it. The piece that's missing is that there also is a real concern and a deep understanding when it comes to climate change. These tremendous storm events that we had in Maine last December and January, how we prepare our state and our economy, right? How do we do that together? How do we reduce our emissions to do our part? All of those things are on the minds of Mainers who are trying to do their thing every single day. A lot of them who work outside in these terrible weather events. And there are absolutely ways we can do things about that, but we also have to acknowledge that storm recovery costs are some of the biggest drivers of our current electricity rates. And that is just something we have to wrap our arms around. We have to do right by our communities, and we have to address those things head on.
You two are so articulate. I love that. So let me ask you a question somebody put forward here about which you have a unique viewpoint on is how much does it matter in the presidential race that one of the candidates is a woman?
Oh, I'll be honest. So I'm happy to take this, right? So as some people might know, I spent the last 6 years as executive director of an organization called Emily's List. Emily's List is not named for me. That was a very happy coincidence that I was the executive director of that organization. And Emily's List works to elect Democratic pro-choice women to office. And so what I can say is that when women run, they win. Laurel is an example of that. I'm an example of that. Oftentimes the biggest barrier is getting a woman to put her name on the ballot. In the case of Kamala Harris, we have someone who happens to be a woman, but the fact that her leadership has included being a district attorney, being the Attorney General of California, being the United States Senator from California, and also Vice President of the United States, her work, her leadership, and her candidacy speak for themselves regardless of gender. And so it's an interesting opportunity that we have here to both make history and also have one of the most qualified presidents ever in history. And I think that's where you see this really awesome coalition coming together to support Vice President Harris. It's not because she's a woman. It's because she's a leader ready to lead our country into this next chapter, ready to do the right thing, to make hard choices, to work with Republicans, which is why you've seen so many Republicans across Maine even stand up to support her. So I think it matters in that representation matters, to see yourself reflected in government, whether you agree with somebody or not, to know that somebody who has something in common with you can be there matters. But I don't think that the fact that she's a woman is going to be the decision maker for people at the ballot.
You know, I actually, you know, when I talk to folks who say that they're voting for Kamala Harris, I do sometimes hear that, you know, they're voting for her because she's a woman. And so I think that we should acknowledge that does come into play for some folks.
It's a big deal. Like,
there are people voting
it's
for
also
her
a really big deal
solely for that reason. But you know, I think that as we look at that race, that's certainly not the only factor to look at. But so this race has had so many crazy things, right? We did not know what to expect from one moment to the next. We've got multiple assassination attempts. We had one Democrat candidate and then a very late in the day shift to Kamala Harris, but she's essentially in the incumbent role, right? She is vice president right now, and yet her campaign is kind of centered around her as a change agent. So that's a hard thing to pull off. And I am not sure, you know, from recent polling that she is pulling that off right now. And that has nothing to do with being a woman or not a woman. That has to do with just the campaign that she's running and the ideas she's getting across or not, and how people are resonating with that or not here in Maine.
I think that the point about being a change agent is real, right? That is the challenge that she has, being the current vice president and actually running an entire campaign for president in, I don't do math in public, but I don't know, about 100 days or so, right? 100, give or take. She has had a challenge to introduce herself to most people, because people think it's like being a state legislator. You kind of think people must know who I am. That is not true. Most people do not know who you are. As someone who ran in the 2nd district, I can tell you the first sobering moment is when you get the initial pullback that's like, super, you've been wicked smart, but nobody really knows who you are. When you're the vice president, it's sort of the same way, right? Until you're running for president. So she had to introduce herself and also articulate the difference between her and former President Trump at the same time. It's a monumental task, and I think she's lived up to it. Absolutely. I watched her closing argument speech last night, and I was just really struck by how focused she is on the future, about the tangible things like lowering the cost of prescription drugs, tangible things like more home ownership in America, keeping us safe, making sure that Medicare will cover the cost of home care, absolutely protecting the right to choose all across America. And really that pledge, very public pledge, that I'll be honest, irritates some Democrats sometimes, some more progressive Democrats, how often she is out there with Liz Cheney, right? Talking about the Republican support. Again, in a paper that I'm not sure I'm allowed to talk about, I noticed that this afternoon an op-ed was posted by former Congressman Dave Emery, Republican Congressman from Maine Dave Emery, and former Republican Senate President Kevin Ray, articulating their support for Kamala Harris. It's personal. It is about the future of Maine. It's about the future of our country. That's exactly why she's been focused on those things. And it absolutely is a monumental task. And I think she's lived up to it.
Okay. First, I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions that you'd like me to ask or to put it in the Q&A button down here. Many of the questions that people are asking are things that are really, you can't really answer. Things like, what would Jared do about something or another? Because you're not Jared. Neither of you is a representative of the campaign. You're just so that doesn't really come into it.
We also don't speak for Kamala Harris nor Donald Trump. So
no, just for yourselves. Just for yourselves. Okay. So in the second district, there is a ton of money pouring in here. Why is that happening, and does it make any difference?
Yeah, I mean, you hit a saturation point at some point, right? People just start tuning it out, and I have to wonder if we're there. When you get 9 mailers in your mailbox in one day, that money, can only do so much. But the money's pouring in is an indicator of, how important that race is. In the grand scheme of things, right? It's one of a few seats that both parties are really going after. And the piece about the election that we haven't really talked about yet that's so interesting to me is how early voting could impact the presidential race, the CD2 race, the legislative races here in Maine, because we're seeing unprecedented levels of early voting. Sure, we saw unprecedented levels of early voting in 2020, of absentee voting in 2020, but that was because of the government response to COVID. And so this is very different, where we're seeing this, whether it's eagerness of folks to be done with the election or eagerness to make their voice heard and cast their vote, whatever reason, folks are turning out in very high numbers, particularly Republicans, but also folks who are the unenrolled, right? Who traditionally think of themselves as independents. And so, in the presidential race, in CD2, in the legislative races, who is turning out these independents? And I don't think that answer is quite clear. And a lot of that money is driving at these folks. These are the swing voters who are going to probably be the decision makers in this election. So we're seeing them turn out in large numbers with early voting, and a lot of that money is driven towards them and towards getting them to turn out now and on election day.
Yeah, so money definitely means a number of things, right? It means all the things Laurel said about the sort of eyes on the prize for both parties. It also, in this case, has to do with the control of the U.S. House, right? Could come down to a very small number of seats. Jared is one of 12 or 13, I think, maybe not even that many seats, Democratic seats held across the country that were won by President Trump in 2020. It's not very many. And so when you look at the landscape, it means the competitive maps are not very many, which means there's a lot of money to go in to winning them. So that's one thing. I mentioned in the pre-show to Laurel that I was near her district yesterday speaking at Auburn Middle School. I was invited there by Mr. Burke, invited me to come speak to his middle school kids. And when they had voted in the election the week before, and as you pointed out earlier in the show, like you said, at Auburn Middle School, Donald Trump won the presidential, and Jared Golden won the second district race. And I asked the kids, so who do you know who's on the ballot? And they were all like, Jared Golden and Austin Theriault. And you know why? And I said, I asked, how many of you have seen ads? All of their hands went up, right? And they were like, I said, how many of you are ready to see the political ads stop? And they were all like, enough already. And they were telling me how, you can't even skip them. And I was like, that's money makes you watch them before you get to whatever the reel is you're trying to watch. And so it was funny to me to see kids because they knew so much about this race and how the candidates were talking about one another because of those ads, right? So as much as people talk about, oh, it doesn't matter, people don't see it. The thing is, when it's convenient for you as a campaign to communicate with someone may not be the convenient moment for them to hear you, right? Because they are worried about paying their bills or taking care of a loved one, getting their kid to school, right? Worried about a health issue. They may not have time to absorb your thoughtfully crafted positive or negative campaign ad that you spend a lot of money on polling on. So the saturation level is exactly right. People have to send a message over and over and over again, or it doesn't get through. But you're getting through when the middle school kids are groaning because they're like, I've seen so many ads. And I thought that was an interesting indicator. But ultimately, it comes down to national interests who want to see control of the House go one way or the other. That's one major factor, but the other major factor is Mainers who really care about the leadership that represents them in Washington. We've seen them be thoughtful many times, splitting tickets before with different parties, and I expect that they'll do it again.
Okay. So one of the other questions that's come in, what would you share with a friend who lives in this district and is on the fence about who to vote for? What would you say to convince them?
I think that does make us apologists. Oh, Emily, why don't
So
you?
I'm not out there making the case right now, right?
Yeah.
But
Right.
the people I talk to, I'm not a candidate for office right now. I'm not doing anything to persuade voters, besides being myself every day, talking to people. And what I always talk to people about is start with what you care about. What is it? What is the story of your life and the thing that leads you to think about certain things when you get out of bed in the morning? What is it? Is it the cost of X, Y, or Z? Is it the security of your job? Is it the future of your kid or your grandkids or your nieces or your nephews? And think about those things and then figure out the candidate that's caring about those too. And in the same way you would. Because I think for some voters, it's about them. It's about them personally. I think for a lot of voters, it's about the people they care about. It's about the loved ones that they're trying to take care of. It's about the younger adults who are trying to figure out helping out their parents, right, entering older age. It's thinking about saving for retirement. It's really thinking about the place you grew up going to camp or going on the coast that is changed now because the weather events that have changed it. So I think it's a personal thing ultimately for the people who are undecided or haven't made up their mind yet. It's sort of like, what do you care about? But I am also not afraid to say to them, it matters who's in charge. It matters who has the votes to win. And again, as someone who has served in the majority and the minority, I know that math, right? And so I say to them, think about the team you want working on your issues and who should be in charge to do that, even if you don't always agree with them. And that's where your vote should go.
Yeah.
Okay, Laurel.
So, earlier we were talking about how folks vote right down the ballot, and they know the big ticket races, and everybody knows those names. And then as you go down the ballot, maybe folks are less familiar. And one thing that I know to be absolutely true is the government that's closest to you is the government that impacts you the most. And that starts right at your town level and goes up, through the state legislature, and then on up, right, to those congressional and then Senate and then presidential races. I feel really strongly about that. The decisions that we make in Augusta that you helped weigh in on, Emily, when you were in the legislature, that now I am weighing in on in the legislature, those are the decisions that really impact Mainers the most, right? Their bottom line. So I absolutely agree. I think Mainers should consider, what is the future that you want for your kids? What is the future that you want for your grandkids? Do you want an economic future where they're going to stay in Maine instead of currently, we see see a lot of brain drain. We see young adults leaving our state at unprecedented numbers. We are known as, the oldest state in the nation. And that's not a ding on anyone. That is just stating the facts. Do we want to be a state that's known for that stat, or do we want to be known as a state that is bringing economic opportunity to families and businesses and individuals, so that folks are flocking to Maine instead of fleeing Maine for economic opportunity? What future do you want for your kids and for your grandkids? And so as you consider voting, think about those down ticket races, and think about if you want the same in Maine as we've had for many years, or do we want something new? And is your life better now than it was 4 years ago? Both, for your family, for your business, as an individual. If it is, great. But if it is not, then consider how much where you vote on that ticket, up and down the ticket, impacts your daily life and will in the future, and vote accordingly.
So one of the things that strikes me listening to both of you, you're both sounding reasonable, likable people. How come there is so much bitterness and anger and rage even out on the campaign trails and among some of the people in the public? Where's that coming from, and what do we do about it?
I mean, I'm going to just be honest and say, I think people take their cues from the top. And I think right now, unfortunately, we have former President Trump has elevated the rhetoric in a way that is not productive. It's not safe. It's not kind, and it's not inclusive. And it's not really representative of the America I've worked hard for every day, that the Republicans I've worked with have as well. Does not match the Republicans that I know, that I have worked with in Maine. And so I have been frustrated by that. And I think there's certainly some of it on both sides. I think the overall, the rhetoric has become frustrating and sad. And I think we can do better than that. That's one of the reasons I did watch, I watched Vice President Harris's closing argument speech last night, because I wanted to see what tone she struck. And yes, there are certainly elements of contrast, right? But ultimately, she was focused on her plans and her priorities for the country. The same way I think you see Democrats like Jared Golden articulating his why in the end, focusing on his family. You got to draw contrast. That's fair. That's fair game in politics. You got to do it, right? But you can do it in a way like we're doing tonight, right? That is respectful, that is focused on issues and facts and people, and not name calling and bringing people down. And I think that's what we deserve in Maine. And I think we deserve somebody who's going to put country first. And in this race, I think for president, Kamala Harris is the one who's done that every single day.
I think that a lot of the hyperbole that we see, and I'll be honest, I'll throw both sides under the bus. I think we're seeing it from the top on both sides. And I think it's reported differently, but I think we're seeing it on both sides. I think that's part of the reason that folks are so tired of the election, both at the federal level and even here in Maine. There is that negative side to the campaigns. And I think what people are hungry for is to hear where folks are on the issues. And they do get tired of the mudslinging. I don't think it's fair to paint that as only on Donald Trump at this point. I think it's gotten pretty nasty on both sides. And I think that's making people really eager to see the end of this election cycle.
So one of the questions we got is, which candidate is most likely to show the courage of Margaret Chase Smith?
Ooh.
I mean, I got to tell you, as much as I disagree with him sometimes, I'm going to give that in this election right now, I think you got to give it to Jared Golden for being willing to make his own party uncomfortable often, right? I think he does it a lot. I think he does it. I don't always agree with him, but he does. He's not afraid to get up and say, here's what I think and why. And I know you're going to disagree with me, but I'm going to tell you about it more. And I think in this moment, in this campaign cycle, he's the one who's been most willing to step out and make people uncomfortable on all sides.
I'm gonna disagree with you a little bit there again, Emily. We had to have that come in somewhere, but we could smile too. Jared Golden votes with his party 88% of the time. That's a statistic I've heard over and over again. And so I certainly can appreciate that during campaign season, it's especially important to appear independent-minded. And you're right, he has absolutely made Democrats uncomfortable. It kind of, though, reminds me, on my own side of the aisle in 2020, we had a tough Senate race. And there were Republicans who said, I'm not going to vote for Susan Collins. At the end of the day, they did, right? And Susan Collins is back in her seat. I don't know if that same will play out with Jared Golden. Will Democrats kind of do the same, plug their nose and vote for him, even though they're mad that he said, Donald Trump could win and it won't be the end of democracy? I don't know. That's the question that is still to be determined.
Who would you give the Margaret Chase Smith then to? That was
Oh,
the question.
gosh.
You didn't need to agree with me. I didn't expect you to agree with me. I just want to know who you think deserves the Margaret Chase
Chase
Award this year.
That's a really incredibly high bar.
It is,
for
but
a
if you
really
gotta
special
pick
Mainer.
somebody,
And
who do you pick?
I'm gonna not give it to anybody. I mean, that's fair, right? I think that's a really high bar. Margaret Chase Smith was a really incredible human, and I would say that's a really high bar that I would not deign to give to anyone without meeting a really specific set of criteria.
That's fair. Okay, we're getting very close to the end here. Let's see for a question.
Well, and I think, there's been a couple things I think that I want to just put in the mix here. And I think when Laurel was talking earlier about the kind of state of Maine situation, right? And I think what you were talking about, whether people are living here or not, since COVID, we've seen a lot of people move to Maine, right? And actually, Maine is a place that people have been moving to. In fact, many of our smaller towns in more rural Maine have been having an influx of people, and they're like, they don't know what to do with them all the time. And it's ultimately going to be good for Maine, I think, to have more people living in more places across the state. We see people moving to Maine because comparatively, we are doing better in climate change than other states, right? And because of our positioning. And right now we're seeing, and we just have had stories this week about higher enrollment in our university and our community college system. So I think we have a positive story to tell. And particularly when you look at the legislature this cycle, this past session, you had a legislature, and I'm a budget person. Steve, you might remember, I was chair of the Appropriations Committee and balanced unanimous bipartisan budgets every single time when I was the chair. Take budgets really seriously. And I think ultimately in this past session, there was not a lot of bipartisan support for the budgets. You had only one of my favorite humans, actually one of my favorite people, Representative Solomon Millett, who's now leaving the legislature, Republican, was I think the only House Republican to vote for the budget this cycle. And that budget did good things, right? That there was funding in that budget for not just for schools, but also the biennial supplemental budget this year, had many projects in it that members across the state are now taking credit for, but also had money to support the victims of the Lewiston shootings, to support mental health. And I think that these are the kinds of conversations
Emily,
people need to get into.
I think I got to cut you off quickly and give Laurel a chance to give a quick answer before the done.
Absolutely. Since we're diving into the budget, I'm also going to point out that it has the largest tax increase we've seen in decades, with the 1% payroll tax that will be going into effect in January. It repealed the property tax freeze for seniors. And so it did not get bipartisan support, because as much as there might be things in it that folks did support, there are also other things in it that definitely are not going to benefit Maine people, and in fact are actively harming Maine people. And so there was not bipartisan agreement. I wish that we could find that common ground like you did when you were in the legislature, Emily, but we're not there. And part of that reason is because the current majority is forcing through their agenda without regard for all of Maine, including that second Maine that feels like they're left behind.
So there we go. We don't agree about everything.
No, we can't. But I think we can agree that tomorrow is the last day of early voting, and people should vote. And if you can't get there tomorrow on Halloween, costumes are fine to take with you to the polling place. That's not a disqualifier. And otherwise, see you there on Tuesday on Election Day across Maine, and we'll be watching those results roll in. And it was great to be here tonight.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate the invitation. Had a great time chatting with you, Emily, and I hope folks found it enjoyable and enlightening, and go to the polls and vote.
Thank you both. That was great. I don't know if somebody else has to get on here and say goodbye or how this works.
There we go.
Okay.